Welcome to the Real Bible Rob podcast. And today I'd like to talk about an overused word. People are afraid to use it, and that is fascism. I've spoken a little bit about it before, about especially pastors and their response to fascism in season 130, episode 36, which was published on March 22nd in 2025. And then I'll also follow up a little bit about what I talked about in the war on empathy in season 153, July 16th, 2025, and how these go together. Because we've reached a point where people aren't afraid to use those words anymore, and there are the concerns about applying the word fascism isn't as frightening to especially like columnists and people like that because of the way things have happened, especially with like the ICE raids in Minneapolis, for example, but also just sort of the march of things going worse than expected during 2025 and into 2026. So I want to talk a little bit about the pastor response to that a little bit, but talk kind of tie together these two previous episodes, like I said, episode 36 and episode 53, in a way that matches what Jonathan Rauch, who is a columnist for The Atlantic, published on January 25th, 2026. Yes, it's fascism. And he lists point by point by point about what we've been seeing in the United States and the pastor's response to that. So, and about how Christian nationalism ties into that. So, you know that I've been talking about this quite a bit. And when I look back to some of the things that became more apparent through 2025, you can start putting these pieces together. And that's what I hope to do with you today. So, what I want to do is I want to talk about Romans 13, 1 through 7, which is often used by religious people, Christian nationalists, to say that you have to obey the government. And Paul says so. Now, of course, they only use it when it serves their purpose, and it's kind of a common feature of evangelical Christianity to use scripture piece by piece in order to build a narrative that then they can say they have scriptural basis for their narrative. And I also will talk a little bit about Jeremiah 17, especially 9 and 10, and the war on empathy. Because the war on empathy ties together, and you can't really do fascism, which always co-opts religion, always co-opts the church. You can't do that unless you also have a war on empathy. And that's something else that Jonathan Rauch talked about. So when you look at it through that lens, and then you can look back and you can overemphasize what happened in Germany, because we certainly aren't in 1930s Germany in many respects, and we do have institutional strengths that they didn't have then, but the playbook is the same. And that's what when you go down that list of things that fascists do in order to gain power and use religion to gain that power, uh, and spread ideas about the media, look back to a false past and things like that. When you do that, then you realize that this is uh, you have to have a war on empathy in order to make that work. And that's a key part of that. So let's get started by talking a little bit about the two aspects of Romans 13. And Romans 13 there's people always quote Romans 13, 1 through 7. Let every person be subject to governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. That may be very familiar to you. Um, When you get down to verse 7, it starts talking about taxes and it starts talking about obeying the law. And that Paul's just saying, don't pick fights that you shouldn't pick because we have a higher purpose. And if you stop at verse 7, which most people do, then when they're using this verse for their political agenda, you always have to go to verses 8 through 10. And I'll read those out because then you begin to see the context. You see the context in when you look at chapter 12, and then you see, where Paul says, be transformed, don't be part of this era or part of this world, but to be transformed. And then then if you look after this in verse 8 here, then you can see the context of Paul talking about the authorities. He says, owe no one anything except to love one another, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. Interesting. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not commit murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, or any other commandment are summed up in this word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Verse 10, love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. So this, if you take verses 1 through 7 in order to promote cruelty, in order to push your neighbor down, you are ignoring what Paul's main message is here, and that is that all these other laws, all these commandments that we talk about, the 10 commandments, are summed up in that you should love your neighbor as yourself. That's, that makes a lot of sense to us, but you can always separate that and you can say, well, I'm really loving my neighbor. People say, I'm really loving my neighbor by pointing out their problems or basically lording over them. And by saying that I'm better than you, this big project. But love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is fulfilling the law. When you look at it that way, then you go, oh, you really can't use Romans 13 for your fascist project, even though people do all the time, because it requires that selective picking and choosing. And then we'll go to Jeremiah 17, which I've also talked about quite a bit before. And if you want to look back, I have an episode where I talk about what the heart means and what the kidneys mean in Hebrew. And this is the one that is used by, especially by Reformed people, the people like Desiring God crowd and so forth, and says, I'll start with verse 7 because it kind of leads into it, but it's verse 9 and 10 that everybody talks about. Verse 7 of Jeremiah 17 is, blessed are those who trust in the Lord, whose trust is the Lord. They shall be like a tree planted by water, sending out its roots by the stream. It shall not fear when heat comes, and its leaves shall stay green. In the year of drought, it is not anxious, and it does not cease to bear fruit. Then comes the big verse. The heart is devious above all else. It is perverse. Who can understand it? Verse 10, I, the Lord, test the mind and search the heart to give to all according to their ways, according to the fruit of their doings. Now, people have taken this as that saying, well, empathy, which is a heart thing, maybe a feminine trait that a lot of these people use, and say you can't trust the heart. But in context, this means you can't trust your political calculation and your deviousness. That's what heart meant in Hebrew, and that that this is true because the very next one, and this is the NRSV. There are different ways that translators have dealt with that. It's really the mind. The heart is the mind, the lavav. I, the Lord, test the mind and search the heart. And that heart in verse 10 is actually the kidneys, which is where the seat of emotion was, seat of passion in Hebrew. And that's the way the NRSV deals with it. If you want more detail, you can go to my other episode about this. But the point here is that all of that stuff about trusting in God, all about that stuff about having your roots search out and find fresh water and so forth, is all about um, getting nourishment, and that nourishment isn't only in the mind, but is checked by the conscience or the emotions, that you're a whole being. This gets ripped apart, and it's saying that, and verse 9 is taken all by itself out of context and used to say you should not have empathy. Now, I've spoken about Joe Rigney before and Allie Beth Stuckey, who are both really. Allie Beth Stuckey has no biblical education whatsoever, and she is just a political operative. It was also Charlie Kirk, who also had no biblical education at all and regularly misquoted the Bible. And he also talked about a war on empathy. Now, Joe Rigney does have a lot of biblical education. He's a pastor, but has intentionally used this verse to promote the idea that you can't trust your heart, you should not have empathy. He calls it toxic empathy, but empathy is sin. He talks about empathy being sin, and Allie Beth Stuckey talks about toxic empathy. And they're the two authors that are used very often. What they don't, whether I don't, I'm not going to impugn their motives, but the thing is that those books and the suppressing of empathy is a big part of the fascist project. And it was part of the fascist project through history. Whenever you saw it, it was to take the words. You saw it in 1930s, 1920s, and 1930s Spain. You saw it in Italy with Mussolini, and certainly, of course, you saw it with Hitler and with his goons. Essentially, took the language of religion and then said, "See, you shouldn't have empathy." When you see people being dragged off, when you see people being murdered in the streets, we're doing God's will. So you might have a bad feeling in your tummy about that, but you shouldn't act on it because we're doing God's will. That's their logic, right? And they use this idea that empathy, that deep seated sharing of the guts that we have with other people, you need to suppress those feelings because those feelings are not useful, or they're against the state. It's against the project. And that's why so maybe unwittingly, people like Joe Rigney, who should know better, who does know better, but he's promoting an idea, right? He's promoting this sort of uh, fundamentalist nationalist idea. Should know better. I give him no quarter, but he's promoting fascism. He's promoting government takeover of all aspects of life, a totalitarian point of view. Allie Beth Stuckey and Charlie Kirk were no different or were different in that neither of them do know better. That they're political operatives. They always were and have been. So that maybe we can give them a little more quarter. Where does this come from? So I wanted to mention a few others. I have mentioned about how Bonhoeffer is used by Christian nationalists today, especially like Eric Metaxas, to talk about how, those liberals, the problem was back in, the 19th century when liberalism came up, and, that fascism came out of a reaction to liberalism, or came out of liberalism, which is complete nonsense. Absolute total misreading of it. Bonhoeffer and Karl Barth, it's mostly Karl Barth who they're talking about here. Uh, that they criticize liberals, but what they criticized is a kind of Christianity that was devoid of any human compassion. That's what they were talking about, not talking about liberal ideology, right, or critical views of Scripture. because you can be very critical of Scripture. You can even be an atheist and still have and completely have no belief in Scripture and still be compassionate, empathetic, and support democracy and human rights. I mean, give me a break. But these guys and that ideology that's become prevalent today by people like Merrick Metaxas, for example, really has its roots in the mid 20th century with somebody named R.J. Rushdoony. If this isn't a familiar name to you, that's okay. But Rushdoony was sort of the very strong um, uh, proponent of the idea of a traditionalism and a reactionary. He was a total reactionary. He was part of the Presbyterian Church. In fact, he was a Presbyterian pastor, and I've spoken about that a little bit too. Is that we Presbyterians were not the leaders in civil rights or moving forward. We were reactionary quite a bit, and there's still quite a bit of reactionary attitudes in the Presbyterian Church. But at the time, he was definitely part of that project of trying to go back to a false originalism or phony originalism, as I like to call it, very much in the idea of authoritarianism and very much used by fascists. What do fascists do? They look for a phony originalism, going backwards. It's very much part of it, and they use religion to do that. So he promoted the idea that society was falling apart because of faithlessness, because of moving away from God. He was very racist, and he resisted civil rights, and he just like a lot of people have pushed hard against Brown versus Board of Education and civil rights and so forth, and then recast it as being faithless. Now, and you hear that today a lot, so you may be familiar with that idea, is that the reason why society is falling apart and people are cruel to each other and all these bad things happen is because we've moved away from God, right? And a very old idea. We've moved away from the Bible. Well, Rushdoony pushed it very, very hard, became sort of the intellectual father of these ideas for a lot of people. Francis Schaeffer really came out of that Rushdoony view of Scripture. There were others, like R.C. Sproul definitely had that. There were a number of Reformed pastors, but whereas R.C. Sproul wasn't particularly political, Francis Schaeffer was very political. He promoted the idea, and he became the intellectual godfather, you could say, of the moral majority. So he pushed that idea very much, is that we have to go back to some kind of originalism, some kind of traditional Reformed theology to do that. Now, so that's a lot of history. What I really enjoyed about seeing the article from Jonathan Rauch, who is a very, I would say, uh, uh, moderate kind of columnist, he was very afraid of using the word um, fascism about Trump and MAGA over the last decade, because he was worried about you make too many allusions to Nazism and to the past, then it starts sounding like a clanging bell, and you can't hear the truth anymore. Plus, he goes, the historical allusions aren't perfect, so you could always have people come back and punch holes into it. And that, we all are in that, especially pastors. We spend a lot of time wanting to reach out to people and have them hear us without shutting their ears, without closing their minds. When we're too far ahead of them, or we're considered too radical, then people will just shut us out. They'll leave the church, whatever. They won't hear the truth. And so you always have to give people, convince people in a calm way, you know, uh, I saw an interesting thing about uh, Lincoln and Douglas in the debates that they had before Abraham Lincoln became president. And Douglas was very convincing because he was uh, very emotional, and he pushed all the buttons. He got people, uh, on his side, kind of in this way that we see in the, with Trump and the MAGA movement, is that if you push everybody's buttons and you're really loud. Now, of course, Douglas was a wonderful debater and a real intellectual, but his force of will convinced or won people over. But then whenever Lincoln came up, Lincoln had this high, thin voice. He spoke very calmly. And what he would do is, instead of being bombastic, what he would do is he would put a little hook into you, and and then use that intellectual hook into people. And then he would use that to build this case slowly, bit by bit by bit. And this is something that pastors have to learn too. It's easy to be bombastic, and I'm a pretty emotional guy, and sometimes I do use emotion in the pulpit. But I realize that, yeah, you can get people worked up, but that's not what lasts. That's not. It's the little intellectual hooks. It's the um, little ideas that stick in people for, you know through the week. Sometimes these little ideas will stick into people for years. Those are the things that move people. And this is the way Jonathan Rauch was talking. I think a lot of pastors, a lot of people who've been doing commentary, realize that if you're a clanging bell, you might get people worked up, and there's a place for that, right? People aren't going to go out and protest or make major changes without some passion, right? But it's the intellectual hooks that will live with people and help them create a narrative that will work with them. So that's what he does in this article, and I really encourage you. It's the January 25th, 2026, in the Atlantic, and it's called "Yes, It's Fascism," and he goes through step by step by step, um, and his rationale for not being more bold about saying it, and then giving out a very strong case. And you can come out and go, yeah, it's so yelling Nazi, Nazi, Nazi is not going to get you much, get you very far. For people who are resistant and like what's going on. But fascism and the idea of how that relates into totalitarianism, how that relates into this, what's happening like with Viktor Orban in Hungary. It's very sneaky, and it's been part of the moral majority, which became the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025 for decades and decades, for 50 years in America. And uh, I think we're starting to see that the project of the last 50 years in evangelicalism is really the same project that we had with um, John Birch Society before that, and Jim Crow before that, and really, part of the lost cause of the 19th century. That's what we are dealing with, and it's always there. It's always a project, as Heather Cox Richardson likes to say, of saying that certain people are better than other people, and that's a huge part of this. It's anti gospel, definitely, to say that other people that we're better than other people. Now, people will dress that up and to say, well, that's because I have Jesus and you don't have Jesus, and all of that evangelical stuff. But I think you have to just kind of stand back and realize that as pastors, as religious people, anybody who has any kind of religious authority, whether it's elders, pastors, or just people who think deeply about these things, is you have to understand how Romans 13 is misused, and then how Jeremiah 17, 9 through 10 is misused to create this idea that you don't trust your gut, don't trust your conscience, that the project is what Jesus wants, and you that how you stay steady with this, how you deliver the message is super important, because again, you can't be crazy about it, otherwise people just are going to shut their ears and shut their eyes. And that's what happens. I mean, and it certainly happens with me. I think about it constantly. I go, when I preach, when I do social media, when I do things like this podcast, I go, I've got to have people. I have to hook them. I have to have people keep their ears, their ears open, their eyes, and not just the people that are, in agreement, which is, of course, most people who take the time to do it, but also to equip people and just have people who maybe have been taken in or have been very reluctant to talk about things as being fascist, um, and or to see the project. Now, Jonathan Rauch says two things that I think kind of help with this. He says, while Vance, Trump, and the MAGA people don't propound an explicit ideology of racial hierarchy, they make no secret of pining for a whiter, more Christian America. And those two go together. Is that, yeah, they'll just say it's Christian, but it's really both. And it's that project. And that's why you can make that connection to, Jim Crow and so forth, and the lost cause narrative. They'll say things like, we want Europe to remain European, which is a rallying cry, and that they have been using explicitly white nationalist themes in their in their literature, in their their posters, like the Department of Homeland Security. Things like the National Park System has been taking down displays about slavery. And why? Because it doesn't fit the narrative. You want to control the narrative. Now, the other part of this too, and this is where I do appreciate this idea of what Heather Cox Richardson talks about and others have, is that really David Brooks has talked quite a bit about this, is to kind of go back to this Hobbesian way of seeing things. There was always Hobbes, who talked very much about, was a very pessimistic view of self-governance, whether people can govern themselves. And then there's John Locke, who was optimistic about, given the right conditions, people can govern themselves. Well, John Locke has won in America for most of American history, but every once in a while, this Hobbesian idea, a pessimistic idea, comes up. And that is basically that might makes right. Very, very much part of MAGA, very much a part of Trump and what's going on right now, is that might makes right. And it's characteristic of fascism. It is a absolute, every fascist regime uses the bully. And George Orwell called it bully worship in 1984. The principle that the strong will do what they can, and the weak just have to suffer what they must. So the idea that we bully our neighbors. Now, this is where it gets complicated, because sometimes you do have to use leverage. Sometimes you have to negotiate. I mean, you have to do it in foreign policy. The Europeans have lived off of American military power for 80 years now. We need to kind of move that. I'm not saying anything about, and sometimes you have to use hard power. You have to use military power to get things done. That we know about that. But if that's your only tool, if that's the only thing that you do, and and you cynically look at human beings as only responding to the bully and only responding to power, then you miss the point. And that is in the totalitarian handbook, in the fascist handbook. That's what it is. So that's why when you use these scriptures about authority, or you use scripture in an authoritarian way, you're just doing the bidding of the people that have this project. So I think that is the connection, that's the connection I want to make. That's hopefully a connection that you can find useful. Because whenever you hear these things about how authority is used, it's not that authority is bad. It's not that we should sometimes subsume our desires to authority, but we always should know why we're doing it. And it's not that we should say that emotions are bad or passions are bad. And of course not, because emotions and passion are what give us our conscience and put a check on what's logical. So I would like to close by talking about a little bit about business and CEOs. I spent, majority of my career in business, in sales, marketing, and so forth. I did get to spend quite a bit of time, especially with customers, getting to know CEOs and senior management and stuff like that. Get a lot of exposure. I also ran a factory for a little while, and believe me, when things go wrong in a factory, all of a sudden you get a lot of attention from the senior management of the company, especially the CEO. But uh, what I learned in that is very much kind of, you wonder why these CEOs, like people like Tim Cook, kowtow to Trump, or Jeff Bezos. I mean, here's a guy that was that's brilliant and did a lot of amazing things. Really had a future vision about things, and in fact, in a lot of ways, was very customer focused, and I don't know if empathetic's the word, but definitely not like Elon Musk, who is obviously very psychologically unbalanced. Uh, and then turns into this villain, essentially. Well, money and power does that to people. And that's what happens when you are in business. So the market really helps to level things, that people vote with their wallet. They, when they interact with the market is a good thing like that, because things are data based and people do that. But the thing is that these CEOs, the reason why they're in their position now, and the reason why they're acting the way they are to curry favor with the administration, is that they have to make lots of little compromises along the way. You're not going to become the CEO of a multi-billion, trillion-dollar company by being an iconoclast. No, you have to work within the system. So what's happening here is that, and you saw this in every fascist movement. You definitely saw it in Germany. Is you have to co-opt the business people. You have to make the business people scared, and they're scared of their shareholders. They're scared of their customers. You have to co-opt them and get them on your side, and that's exactly what Trump is doing. That's exactly what's happening right now, and that's why you're seeing the weakness of these CEOs, because it's never the CEOs that are going to be the ones that promote change like that. They're always responding. The only way that we can get them to do what we want to do is with the power of our wallets and protests and public image. So that's why things like boycotts work, and they work fabulously well. If you just look at what happened to Target in the last year, it's amazing. Uh, it only takes 5% of their revenue to make change. If you reduce your spend, or you can promote ways to get a company to lose 5% of their revenue, or that's maybe the most of their, especially in retail, maybe most of their profitability. That's how you get change. Now, you still have idiots in these companies. I just don't understand why they do it, but that believe that that gravity doesn't apply to them, but it does. It always does. So that's why it's important for us to remain true to our faith. That's why it's important for us to be good citizens. That's why what's happened in Minneapolis is probably the watershed for the whole movement, because you have good people. You have two good people by all respects. You look at their life, what they did, who they were. They were good people getting murdered by the government. So you go, that's what makes the difference. It's not what CEOs do. It's not what politicians do. It's how people stand up for what they believe in. It's being strategic in the mind, but not only strategic, being checked by the heart. And you have to do those together. And that's why I think it's so important to understand these verses, how they're used, and how we can go forward with that. So with that, I'll say, people say lots of things about the Bible, especially about authority and how it's used, that aren't really there. That it is important for you to have a heart. Have a heart in our world, have the kidneys in the Hebrew world, and use that as a check. Use your conscience as a check on what you're doing. And, depending on how you vote, how you shop, the things that you say on the street, the things that you say on media really matter. So with that, I'll say, God bless you in this time. What a time we live in. And thank you very much for listening.